Perfect is defined as having all of the required or desired elements, qualities, or characteristics, as good as it's possible to be. No video game is perfect. What's perfect for one person may not be perfect to someone else. With that said, I want to explain why I think Baldur's Gate 3 could be the perfect encapsulation of Dungeons & Dragons in video game form. Between a range of towering mountains, your party reaches the fabled Temple of the Ancients. Legends speak of an artifact of unimaginable power hidden within its depths. The rogue examines the door for traps, discovering a complex mechanism that must be manipulated to gain entry. The wizard deciphers the ancient script, revealing a riddle that holds the key to unlocking the door's enchantments. Solving the riddle, you trigger the mechanism, and the massive stone door grinds open. As you step inside, the temperature drops, and the air crackles with mystic energy. The temple is a labyrinth of intricate corridors, each guarded by magical wards and devious puzzles. In one chamber, a series of glowing orbs floats around a central pedestal. Each orb corresponds to a different element: fire, water, earth, and air. The party must work together to manipulate the orbs, aligning them correctly to unlock the next passage. The tension mounts as each movement risks triggering traps. Deeper in the labyrinth, you encounter a wraith bound to protect the temple's secrets. The barbarian faces memories of past battles lost. The cleric confronts the burden of her divine calling, and the sorcerer grapples with the weight of untamed power. You defeat the wraith and reach the heart of the temple, where the coveted artifact lies within an ancient altar. The rogue carefully examines the altar for traps, discovering a hidden compartment beneath the artifact. With great care, the cleric removes the artifact and the room begins to tremble. The temple awakens and the walls seem to come alive with mystical energy. In a heart-pounding escape, your party navigates through the collapsing chambers and evades magical barriers. The temple crumbles around you as you sprint back towards the entrance, narrowly avoiding peril at every turn. At last, you burst out of the temple just as the mountain tremors reach their peak. The temple collapses behind you, but you are there, standing with the artifact. In this exhilarating moment, you and your friends share a collective rush of adrenaline, celebrating your hard-earned victory. Your characters grow stronger from the experience, and you, the players, bond over the epic tale you just forged together. This is the magic of Dungeons & Dragons, and it's moments like these that Baldur's Gate 3 is trying to replicate with its immersive world, interactive gameplay, and reactivity. It's a prime candidate to capture the essence of the perfect Dungeons & Dragons experience in a video game. Dungeons & Dragons has been around for almost 50 years. Everyone who plays has a different part of the game they love. From combat to role-playing to epic stories and campaigns, there's something for everyone. It's a game that encourages creativity and imagination. The stories can have choice and consequence, and all of this can be done with your friends. There's something special about sitting around a table with a bunch of friends, going on an epic quest to slay a dragon or save a town from some evil. Although nothing beats the feeling of actually playing D&D, different mediums have been trying to capture a little piece of that magic. Recent TV shows, movies, Twitch and YouTube streams have all had success, leading to a boom in the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons. However, there's one medium that's in a unique position, allowing players to actually be put into the game itself: video games. Dungeons & Dragons video games, or games using D&D-like systems, dice rolls, stats, classes, have been around since the beginning of gaming. However, no game was able to capture that feeling of playing Dungeons & Dragons at a table until Baldur's Gate released in 1998. To that point, D&D games had middling success and were actually beginning to get phased out and replaced by better RPGs. Baldur's Gate changed the way players could play D&D on a computer. Players were now able to create their own character, have companions, roleplay, and go on an epic quest around the iconic setting of the Forgotten Realms. It was the closest players got to playing Dungeons & Dragons without sitting around a table with friends. It became an instant classic, which spawned a new age of D&D video games, including the sequel, Baldur's Gate 2. Baldur's Gate 2 came out and changed everything, improving on every aspect of Baldur's Gate 1. It's regarded as one of the best games of all time. An epic story where choice matters, with fun combat and can be played with friends. You could even import your character from Baldur's Gate 1, making one continuous epic campaign. At the time, it was arguably the perfect Dungeons & Dragons video game, making players feel like they were playing at a table. We've had numerous Dungeons & Dragons games since then, with various successes, but none quite getting to the level of Baldur's Gate 2. I am here to tell you, I think Baldur's Gate 3, by developers Larian Studios, can improve on Baldur's Gate 2 and has a chance to be the perfect Dungeons & Dragons video game. Larian has gone all in on making Baldur's Gate 3 a true Dungeons & Dragons game. This starts with the setting and bringing this third installment in the series back to the Forgotten Realms in Baldur's Gate. This fantasy setting has so much history and nostalgia and just screams Dungeons & Dragons. It brings a sense of familiarity, and you know you're in a D&D campaign when you're there. Baldur's Gate 3 is also staying as close to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons as possible by bringing in as much of the player's handbook as they can. Some things from the handbook won't translate well to a video game, or just aren't fun in a video game, so Larian had to make some adjustments there, but they are trying to get as much of the handbook as they can in the game. There are over 600 spells and actions. There are 11 races, 31 subraces, 12 classes, and 46 subclasses, all coming either directly or slightly modified from the handbook. Baldur's Gate 3 is giving players the tools to create any type of character they want, and is invoking that feeling of a first session of creating your character around a table with friends. Larian is also making dice rolls an integral part of the game. Just like at a table, you will roll an in-game dice for skill checks in dialogue and around the world. And dice rolls behind the scenes will play a part in combat, which, like at a table, will be turn-based. All of this is to bring the foundations of Dungeons & Dragons into the game. When I think of Dungeons & Dragons, I don't just think of the setting, the handbook, and turn-based combat. I also think of immersing myself in the world. During a session around the table, it's a world where almost anything is possible, and you are only limited by the rules of the game and your imagination. However, most times in video games, you're limited by rules and technology. Making games is hard. It's even harder when developers let players interact with the world and try to solve quests and puzzles in unique ways. Improving on the foundation that was laid in Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, in Baldur's Gate 3, Larian will give players a problem that can be solved in more than one way. Quests can have multiple resolutions, and puzzles can be solved or even skipped using skills, spells, and creativity. Maybe players can use their high lock picking skill to unlock a door that wouldn't be available otherwise, or their sneak skill to get into a building undetected, or maybe they can jump to a ledge or cast fly to get past an obstacle. The goal of Baldur's Gate 3 is to let players treat the world as they would at the table. Larian is trying to take away as many technical limitations as they can to let the player's imagination be the deciding factor in how something gets done. This interactivity doesn't just come from walking around the world, completing quests, and solving puzzles, but also in combat. Spells will interact with each other and the environment. Enemies can be frozen. Players can dip their weapons into nearby fire on the ground and shove enemies off ledges. Again, another way Baldur's Gate 3 is trying to let the player's imagination and creativity shine within the rules of the game, much like tabletop Dungeons & Dragons. Another important part of Dungeons & Dragons is story and reactivity. Dungeons or game masters put in so much work to create epic stories where choices matter and there are consequences for the decisions you make. Larian has taken this to heart and made a game that will react as few do. There are over 2 million lines of dialogue in the game that take into account where a player has been, what they've done, what race they are, and what class they are, all of which will change how a conversation will go. There are 174 hours of cinematics to account for 17,000 different choices that can be made throughout the game. There will be 10 to 15 different endings players can have based on the choices they make. There are 2,000 characters in the world to interact with. During the game, you will be joined by companions who will react to the different choices you make in the game, give their opinions, help you in dialogue, just like your companions around the table. Speaking of companions, they don't have to just be characters in a video game. They can actually be your friends. Baldur's Gate 3 will have full multiplayer where 3 of your friends can actually be your companions, going on the epic journey with you. They will take turns in combat, they can suggest what you say in dialogue, and you can make choices together on how your story will play out. While you're bound to the world, the choices you and your party members make in the world, you aren't tied at the hip. Your friends can run off and check out other areas, dungeons, and monsters all on their own. Each player will have the ability to move around freely, engaging with objects, creatures, and NPCs without needing to have the rest of the party along for the ride. This also means your friends can run back to town and go shopping while the rest of the party continues on, or goes off on a side quest the rest of the group has decided against. Just like that one party member at the table who always wants to split the group up, you can do that in Baldur's Gate 3. So far, this video has been about why Baldur's Gate 3 can possibly be the perfect Dungeons & Dragons game. We've covered how the setting and rules will be a transformation from tabletop D&D. We've talked about the interactivity and reactivity in the world and how that invokes the sense of playing at a table with a dungeon master. We've talked about multiplayer, allowing you to bring your friends along on the journey. And all of these reasons give Baldur's Gate 3 a chance to be the game that feels most like a Dungeons & Dragons session. But the main reason this could be the perfect Dungeons & Dragons game is Larian itself. The studio is built to make this game. All of their experience with the Divinity games, their love for making games they want to play, and love for Dungeons & Dragons made them the perfect studio to take on this massive task of continuing the Baldur's Gate series. Larian founder and CEO Sven Vinke has mentioned they are meant to make this game and have been trying to for quite some time. They actually pitched Baldur's Gate 3 to Wizards of the Coast in 2014, around the time Divinity Original Sin 1 was finished. Sven told Wizards of the Coast that Divinity Original Sin 1 is literally Dungeons & Dragons with a different setting and rules. Larian's entire premise of Baldur's Gate 3 is using the Divinity engine and then putting the entire world of the Forgotten Realms on top of that and putting the player handbook in it. This is what Baldur's Gate 3 will be, an attempt to be the truest form of Dungeons & Dragons in a video game. Larian makes games they want to play and enjoy playing. They enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. They are the developer with the experience and talent to make this a truly unique game. There will be issues, and there will be parts of the game that players don't like. But with all of the qualities, characteristics, and elements of a tabletop session, I think Baldur's Gate 3 could be the closest we've come so far to playing Dungeons & Dragons in a video game. The perfect Dungeons & Dragons game.